Hi, John Morgan here with the Keep Growing podcast. In this episode, we're going to take a look back at what we've covered so far as we wrap up our basic understanding of plants and some of the key concepts of growing plants. Then we're going to cover the last key to growing plants, and all life on Earth for that matter: water. Then in the next episodes, we'll move on to planning your own plant paradise and some of the tools that can help you find plants that you'll love. At the beginning of the season, we first covered soil. Soil is the skin of the earth. In episode 2, we also learned that the soil you typically find at a garden center isn't really native soil at all.
Years ago, when homeowners or professional growers would make, let's say, as they called it back then, potting soil, they would actually take, native soil you would find in your backyard, in your field, whatever. They would steam it, and they would use that and mix in a few other components to make, shall we say, what we call potting soil, because it was made with soil. Well, the name still sticks to this day of potting soil, but you're right, there's actually no topsoil, which we would refer to as like clay or sand or silt. It's actually mixed into a mix. And part of the reason is because of disease and weight. It's too heavy. So back in the the late 60s, companies like ourselves and other companies after us started developing what we call soilless mix, in which case we mix in ingredients such as peat moss, which is the primary ingredient, and then we mix to that perlite, vermiculite, or as the times continue to go forward, then they started looking at producing mixes with bark in it, coconut core, wood fiber, various materials that can be incorporated into the mix, but there's actually no soil in the mix itself. So the main reason why these components are in there, peat is a nice base as far as producing a good water retention, good aeration. Perlite is introduced to introduce more aeration into the mix, and then vermiculite was used to help kind of retain some of the nutrients, the fertilizer elements in the media, and it also helps a little bit of water retention. Moving it forward, bark was introduced because it was commercially available, especially down in the southern part of our country, and that was used mostly for drainage and also the weight of it. So if you're producing outdoor plants like trees and shrubs, it would keep the pot from tipping over in the wind. And of course, also a lot of those growers would use a little bit of sand. And core, again, is another very similar product to peat moss as far as water retention, aeration. And again, as time moves on, we keep introducing more and more ingredients that continue to be non-soil based in soilless media.
Once you have soil, you need a plant to grow in it. Luckily for us, plants come pre-packaged in tiny containers called seeds. In episode 3, we covered the science of seeds, but also a little bit about getting started with seeds.
You may want to start seeds indoors and outdoors, depending on what you're sowing. And on the seed packet, at least on ours, there's information on starting indoors or starting outdoors, and sometimes I'll put recommended on one or the other. And some reasons that indoor seed starting might be recommended would be because the vegetable, for instance, takes a long time to mature. So, like in my garden in Colorado, we have a short growing season, so I tend to give some things a little head start that other people may not. Another reason we might recommend indoor seed starting is because of the soil temperature needed to get that seed to germinate. It varies with different varieties, especially species, but sometimes even varieties, on what soil temperature is best for germination. Because you want quick germination, because if the seed sits in cool soil, then it has the potential to succumb to fungus or rot in that meantime. Peppers are a really good example of something that should be started inside because they need soil temperatures between 80 and 90 degrees. And if they don't have that, they'll either fail altogether to germinate, or they can take 3 weeks, and then that kind of puts you behind schedule if you're waiting that long. That was a mistake I made my first year farming. So that one always kind of sticks with me. And if you're indoor seed starting, it is really nice to have a grow light. A south-facing window can do, but you'll definitely see plants starting to reach towards that window because it's not nearly as strong as them being directly outside under the sun. So if you have a grow light, you want to have it on for like 14 to 16 hours a day to kind of compensate for not being real sunlight. And then, a soil thermometer is really handy, so you can know where your soil temperature is in case you need to put your seeds in a warmer area or maybe add a special heat mat, which I'm sure your store sells. So those are some factors, environmental factors that affect indoor sowing. And another important one is the media that you're growing in. It should be a seed starting mix, which is different than a potting soil. It's still sterile, but it has generally a finer texture and it dries out more quickly, so the seeds don't succumb to rot. And sometimes they have a little bit of nutrient in it too. But it's really important to use sterile media when starting indoors, because otherwise, if you're using maybe compost from the garden, you can introduce pests and disease and to your fragile little seedlings.
Whether you grow plants indoors or out, light is a key component. It is through photosynthesis that plants take energy from light and convert it into the fuel source for all life on Earth. Even if you're growing plants inside, you still need light. Whether you're using light from a window or a grow light, starting seeds indoors is actually pretty easy. However, don't worry if you make a mistake.
The big thing that I am impressed with people is you can't have a perfect expectation every single time. I've learned more from glorious failures than I ever did from hitting it out of the ballpark every single time. So the best thing with seeds, the best thing with plants, my grandfather used to say, plants suffer fools gently. If you screw up, throw some more seed in, or change where the plant's growing. I mean, there's no hard, set, fast rules about who's doing it right or who's doing it wrong. The plants will tell you. If you learn to watch your plants and you learn to watch the seedlings, little things like if your light that you choose to use is too high above the seedling tray, you'll see the plants actually stretching. Bring that light down a little closer, and the plants will stay a little more basal, and they kind of stretch sideways instead. Little air movement is always good. If it's a little too moist, a little too damp, you run the risk of a little problem called damp off, and your little seedlings come up, and then they get kind of a little fuzzy connection at the soil level, and they fall over. And that's just basically lack of air circulation. So if you put it somewhere where it gets a little air movement, or throw a little fan close to it, that helps. And then most people overwater too much, so they put their seeds in whatever container, and they soak the daylights out of the soil. And if the seeds start coming up, they get all excited and soak it some more, and all of a sudden I get a phone call, hey, my seeds are all looking terrible. And most times it's just, they've watered them too much and they've drowned them. You've killed them with kindness, basically.
Once you've started seedlings indoors, or you're planning on planting seeds outdoors, it's important to know when to plant. This is where your local climate comes into play. Knowing your USDA hardiness zone will tell you the lowest temperature throughout the year for your area, but it's also important to know your first and last frost dates as well. Once you've got plants growing, they're going to need food. Yup, plants eat. In our last episode, we learned about fertilizers. Choosing the right fertilizer is important.
To look for things that say like manure or blood meal or feather meal or something like that. You should also look for the organic phrase and such on the package, claiming that the product's organic. We're regulated. We can't say we're organic if we're not truly organic. And then look for a NPK ratio that is appropriate for what you're trying to do. And generally speaking, if you're trying to take a plant that and coax it into flowering, you generally want a lower nitrogen, which is the first number, and a higher phosphorus and potassium, because that helps encourage blooms. If you're trying to push a lot of growth, you kind of want to go the opposite, and that would be a fertilizer that's higher in the nitrogen, which is again the first number, and lower in the last two. And then one of the last things you should think about is also look for additional ingredients than just the plant foods. New technology has come out, and we're now putting on our products a microbial enhancement that we call biotone. And it's basically, we're applying particular bacteria to these organic fertilizers that have been shown to enhance all aspects of plant growth. So definitely look for the microbial inoculum that helps add life to the soil along with the organic fertilizer.
Finally, there's water. It is the one substance on Earth that is essential for all life. This week's gardening wisdom comes from Loren Isley, a scientist. He said if there is magic on this planet, it is contained in water. Let's start off by taking a look at the properties of water that make it so magical. Water, H2O, is comprised of just that, two hydrogen atoms bonded to a single oxygen atom. So what makes water so unique? Two words, hydrogen bonds. It's a bit complicated, but we can use magnets as an analogy. Basically, in a molecule of water, the oxygen atom is huge compared to the two hydrogen atoms. Since the three atoms share electrons via their covalent bonds, each hydrogen atom's single electron also orbits the oxygen atom. Because they share those electrons with the oxygen atom, the electrons tend to stay close to the oxygen atom. And the outside of the hydrogen atom tends to be positively charged. The oxygen atom has 8 electrons. Most of those tend to stay away from the hydrogen atoms and cause the outside of the oxygen atom to have a negative charge. This is where the magnet analogy comes in. Water molecules will stick to each other because opposite charges attract, positive to negative, like two magnets sticking to each other, North Pole to South Pole. In fact, water molecules are referred to as polar molecules. When two water molecules get close together, the polar forces work to draw the molecules together. The atom of one water molecule will bond with several hydrogen atoms of other water molecules. As I mentioned before, these bonds are called hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are not as strong as covalent bonds, but they are strong enough to bind water molecules together and give water its unique characteristics. Many of the unique properties of water are due to those hydrogen bonds. For example, ice floats because hydrogen bonds hold water molecules further apart in solid form than in liquid form. Other unique properties include a high heat of vaporization, strong surface tension, high specific heat, and its nearly universal solvent properties. The hydrophobic effect, or the exclusion of compounds containing carbon and hydrogen, nonpolar compounds, is another unique property of water caused by the hydrogen bonds. The hydrophobic effect is particularly important in the formation of cell membranes. The best description is to say that water squeezes nonpolar molecules together. That's just a few of the chemical properties of water that make life possible. Shoot, there's whole chemistry courses devoted to water and the reactions it makes possible. Water helps a plant by transporting important nutrients, like what we talked about in the fertilizer episode. Those nutrients are drawn from the soil and used by the plant. Water carries dissolved sugars and other nutrients through the plant. So without the proper balance of water, the plant is not only malnourished, but it's also physically weak and cannot support its own weight. Without enough water in the cells, the plant droops. So water helps the plant stand. In plant science, this is called turgidity. The best way I can describe this is with a soda can. Before you open up a can of soda, give it a squeeze. The internal pressure of the can is supporting the outside, making it somewhat rigid. Now open the can and give it a squeeze. That internal support is gone. Plant cells are made up of a few layers. The outermost layer is the cell wall. This is a lattice work of somewhat rigid cellulose fibers. Inside the cell wall is the flexible cell membrane. When a plant cell is properly hydrated, the membrane pushes against the cell wall like the soda pushing outward on the can. Alright, I saved water for the last topic when it comes to the basics of growing plants, because it's perhaps one of the hardest things to get right. There's really only 3 options: too much, too little, or just right. But there's the rub. Just like with temperature and light, all plants are different. Some plants, like succulents, can get by with pretty dry soil. And some aquatic plants literally live in water. There's a whole spectrum of water needs in between. When it comes to watering, there's no hard or fast rules. It's a judgment call that depends on the type of plant, the soil, the weather, the time of the year, and many other variables. Fortunately, it's easy to figure out what to do. It's time to get your hands dirty. Sticking your finger into the soil is a good way to judge how much moisture is in the soil. However, there is another option for containers and hanging baskets if you don't want to get your hands dirty. It's called a lift test. Here at Bob's, we grow over 100,000 hanging baskets each year. Many of these get watered automatically by a conveyor system in the ceiling of the greenhouses. Basically, the baskets hang from hooks on a cable system similar to how a ski lift operates. They travel from one end of the greenhouse 600 feet to the other end in a giant loop. When they get to the middle, each basket triggers a switch that causes it to pause and get watered by a sprinkler head. Each system like this holds around 2,500 baskets. When it comes to taking care of all these, we have one grower that's in charge of caring for them. Sometimes when he's running the system, he'll use a pole with a bucket on the end to lift up on the baskets as they pass by. He's checking the weight to ensure that they're getting enough water. You can do the same thing at home. Minus the Rube Goldberg-esque machinery. Eventually, after lifting enough pots, you'll be able to judge how much to water them. It's a skill that takes a bit of practice. With watering outdoor plants, I find that most people tend to underwater containers and hanging baskets. They'll water until they see water coming from the drain hole and assume that's plenty. But here's the problem. Once the peat moss making up the growing mix dries out, it's really hard to re-wet. Water will just run around the outside of the root ball instead of soaking into it. This can trick you, unless you do a lift test. Don't worry though, if your basket or container gets this dry, there is a way to rescue it if the plants aren't too far gone. Soak the entire container in a bucket of water for at least an hour. This will re-wet the growing media and hopefully revive the plant. More generally, when watering outdoor plants, focus on the root zone. It's the roots that need access to water, not the leaves. Wetting the foliage is a waste of water, and it can promote the spread of disease. Along those same lines, water in the morning. If you do get moisture on the leaves, this gives them time to dry out. Finally, mulch, mulch, and more mulch. I've expressed in the past my hatred of weed cloth on the podcast, but mulch is a must. Mulch reduces runoff, and it also slows evaporation from the soil. Now let's talk about houseplants. With outdoor containers, I find the most common problem is underwatering. With houseplants, it's the exact opposite. Overwatering is the #1 cause of death for houseplants. I guess you could say most people kill their houseplants with love. When a plant starts to wilt, most people automatically assume that it needs more water. But wilting is a sign of overwatering too. If you discover a plant has soggy soil, then allow it to dry out a bit before you water again. And if you see tiny black bugs flying around your plant when you go to water, that's soil gnats, that is a sure sign that you're overwatering it. On the flip side, you never want to allow houseplants to dry out to the point where the leaves start drooping and the soil is starting to pull away from the sides of the pot. Some plants can tolerate being dried out to the point of wilting, but there are others that won't recover from this practice, and it can be fatal to the plant. If you find that an indoor plant is drying out too quickly, that's a sign that the pot is root bound, and the plant needs to be potted up to a larger container. In general, indoor plants need more water during the spring and summer months than they do during the fall and winter. Spring and summer is their active growing period. Most indoor plants will go into a state of dormancy during the winter and prefer to have their soil kept a little bit on the dry side. It's okay to get into an indoor plant watering routine, but don't automatically water your plants according to a set schedule. Check the soil of each plant before you water to make sure it needs to be watered. To check the moisture level, just stick your finger into the soil up to the first knuckle. If the soil feels wet, don't water it. Wait a few days and check the plant again. If the container your plant is growing in doesn't have drainage holes, then you're going to have to be extra careful so you don't overwater it. So if you struggle with overwatering your houseplants, I recommend repotting them into a container that has drainage holes. Watering plants, even though it's a relatively simple task, is one of the hardest aspects of plant parenting to master. Last week I was at Cultivate, one of our industry's largest trade shows and conferences. During one of the meetings I was attending, someone mentioned growing orchids, and someone else cracked the joke that you become an expert orchid grower by killing 1,000 orchids. They're notoriously hard to grow, even for professionals. In fact, there's a brand that's even built around their water requirements. Just Add Ice orchids are designed to make sure people water them properly. 3 ice cubes once per week, and that's just right. Watering is one of those skills that takes practice, and you will fail along the way. Growing plants is just one of those things that's best learned by failure. Just like riding a bike, you're going to get some bumps and bruises along the way. Don't get bummed out if you kill a plant. That's an inevitable part of learning to grow them. Sometimes we just have to learn from our mistakes and keep growing. For some more great information about this episode, check out our show notes at bobsmarket.com/keepgrowing. If you're listening on iTunes, Google Play, or other platforms, be sure to give us a review. You can also learn more about Bob's through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and more. If you want to contact me directly with questions, comments, or smart remarks, shoot me an email at keepgrowing@bobsmarket.com. The music in this week's episode is by the 126ers. Copyright 2018, Bob's Market and Greenhouses, Incorporated.